I think we're going to go ahead. We've got this recording, so we will, of course, share this. So if you're just catching up on the recording, hi, sorry we missed you. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.
Excited to dig into a big topic today, something that's expansive, right? It's something that covers decades as well as, very, very acute, immediate sort of focus for a lot of teams, which is how do we evolve the way we work to really get that promise out of systems that we have been pitching, that we probably sold to executives, that seems really simple, but it, 5, 6, 7 years in for a lot of teams has still been a little too elusive to unlock. So we're going to get into a lot of this today, the background, the workflows, the tools, the context, see where we get. Just some shameless plugs for what comes next in our marketing, content, thought leadership efforts. We do have our next webinar is scheduled for the end of September. We're going to be getting into design to code, really as the foundation for future of production, future of how teams think about the maturity of their system. Registration will be opening for that soon, but there are a ton of other events already available if you want to check out our events page. So keep an eye out for registration. Again, always check out our events page. We have lots going on. One of the things we have going on is a weekly live demo. So it's every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 Pacific. If you want to just have dedicated time with members of our team to get really into the nuts and bolts of the tool and what Knapsack can do and how teams are using it, this is a great opportunity. Feel free to sign up for one of those that works for you every single week like clockwork. And lastly, we have a lot of in-person events. We've been doing a series of design system leadership summits really focused on leaders, which is a broad term as well, but typically sort of the team leaders, the directors, the executive level, engineering, product, and design leaders. We have great folks like Dan Mall who come to these and facilitate discussions, and they're really focused on almost more group therapy than anything Knapsack, right? This is about getting folks together that have similar experiences, similar pains. They're looking over their shoulder, wondering if what they're doing makes sense, looking for some community, some validation, and building a network that they can leverage, whether or not they ever use Knapsack, frankly. So these are great, rescheduled firmly, and we're trying to do these almost every month. So look out for more. You'll probably see one of us there. So to get into this, today's topic, I'm excited to be here with Richard. Richard and I have known each other for a long time. We both have a background in the digital production world, first on sort of an agency side, we've been on the product side. We spent some time together at Envision. Richard did some amazing work leading a lot of the design maturity and design transformation services and programs coming out of Envision that I know a lot of us probably remember fondly. And now at Knapsack, I lead strategy, which is sort of chief hat wearer and helping us figure out how we can guide our customers well in scalable ways. And Richard is here to do a lot of that same type of work, facilitate those discussions, facilitate that community, help connect what we hear and see in the market with what we do in our product. And so, Richard, I spoke too much for you, but I'll let you say hi as well. But I'm really excited to be here with you.
Yeah, as usual. And as has been the case for the last few years, what we tend to do more of than we could even possibly imagine is speak to customers who are actually doing the work. So these are both companies that we don't yet work with, but also companies that we have worked with in the past and currently work with. And they're sharing their therapy stories with us, right? Like how they do the work, how they make the sausage. And so we get this somewhat unique view into hundreds of leaders and ICs experiences. How are they making stuff? How are they actually building product? And I think the thing that comes to mind, of course, is that these become very complex very quickly. And becoming very complex very quickly means different things to different people. And some people, they're like, hey, we're doing the job because we're making a lot of things, or we're creating a lot of features, or we're creating a lot of things, just like work for the team. But for the people that are inside that, they often feel the anxiety of having too much, both to understand in terms of tooling or workflow or connections, or even just good old-fashioned communication. So we're going to talk a lot about how we take those big complex things and boil them down into things that are a little bit more fundamental and very, very important. And I'm going to drop this into the chat. I've got a quote here from a guy called Gall, G-A-L-L. This is Gall's law. A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. It started simple. No, it's not so simple anymore. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be patched up to make it work. So really what Gall's law says is that if you don't understand your fundamentals, your principles, your first principles, it's very difficult to build a thing that scales. And we are in that world. We're building, there's no reason to have a design system unless you want to scale, right? There's no reason to have a workflow with lots of participants in that workflow unless you want to make it worthwhile for a lot of people to do a lot of things. The problem, of course, is that that begets complexity. So let's start there, Andrew. We've got the invariable or unavoidable complexity that comes from lots of people working together. But then we've also got this hypothesis, which is we're kind of struggling to work with each other in this complex world. So how do we then balance out the, I need to work with others, but it's also difficult to do that?
Yeah, what comes through to me as you say that is that, it's funny, we use the word systems there in that quote, where you often talk a lot about design systems, but this is much more fundamental to that than that. And I really think of it as a fundamentally human problem, right? And when I look at the challenges with ways of working in digital, and our combined 25, I don't know, 50 probably years of working on this stuff is the pains that we felt that we hear from teams all the time, whether it takes too long or, we got to QA and it didn't look like we thought, these are ultimately expectation gap problems, which is a human thing, right? We've got specialized individuals with specialization of labor. We've been good at that for a few hundred years. We've got executive level leaders. We've got planners. We've got designers. We have QA, accessibility analysts, engineers, and we're trying to get all these people to work together. And the reality of how digital production has sort of evolved and how sort of creation of these experiences has evolved is it's become super easy for everyone to have different expectations, right? And we know that is hard in any sort of relationship, right? Whether it's a personal, a friend, a parent, child, a romantic relationship, a coworker, when expectation and reality aren't aligned, that's the source of most strain on those sorts of relationships. And that includes a relationship of folks in a large group working through a complex workflow, trying to deliver some stuff. So when I look at ways of working and I look at what I've seen over the past, 20 some odd years, I really can start to tie it all back to that. How have we seen this expectation gap grow? And now what's so exciting to a lot of us is what are we starting to see in trends of ways of working, what values people prioritize, but also tooling and infrastructure that's enabling us to close that gap again. And so I have some visuals we can get into of how we start to represent that and take people through a little timeline of going back to when we weren't doing design. Right. Let's get into it. So
because you and I both come from an era, like when we started out, digital design was informed almost entirely by something that had come before it, right? So everything is a version of something that came before it.
Exactly. So we're going to share this. This is, something we use to get into this concept and really start as a thought experiment here internally. What we're looking at is, we've got a couple of pipelines here on the right, a design owned path and an engineering owned path, excuse me. And what we want to represent is what do the stakeholders expect to be delivered? And then what actually gets delivered? Excuse me. And for a long time, engineering determined it all, right? So around 1973, we started to have to launch more digital products at scale. And there weren't really any expectations allowed, right? We said, here's what it is. We built it. It works. We have customers today who are still working on getting over products that have always been built this way, right? In 2024, starting to do it. So this wasn't that long ago. And for a lot of types of products, this has still been kind of the way it's worked, right? Engineering dictates it. It was designed by engineering or within the constraints that they enable.
Especially if you've got a product that has a very slow life cycle, hardware products that have the requirement for tooling in a manufacturing or fabrication sense take a long time to cycle through. So if it was designed, 20, 30 years ago, it may not have been retooled recently because it's just working, right? So these are organizations that we take for granted. We look around. These are, we drive these cars, we drive these trucks, we sit on this furniture. They haven't retooled necessarily in a long time. And so there hasn't been that urge for them to move from that engineering world to a design world.
Right. And then we saw some slight evolution of this, right? Kind of 70s and the 90s. We started to have GUIs, still really mostly established by engineering. And we may or may not be able to improve it. So we could say, hey, we want it to do this. And it was like, well, here's how it works. That's pretty close. Ship it, right? Obviously, making some assumptions here. And then as we get into early web, we started to really have this major shift to where for the first time, expectations were really starting to be defined primarily by design. And this led up through the initial bubble, the dot-com crash, late 90s, early thousands, early aughts, if you will, and kind of up until we got into this Web 2.0 and early native, where we went full tilt into make it look like buttons, high fidelity design, using Photoshop and Illustrator to design things for web. And so we had this, evolution to where design really was controlling expectations entirely, right? And you were running a business doing this through this phase.
Yeah. Yeah. We ran an agency where for 15 years, we were building these interfaces with, Fortune 500 and startup type companies. And as you say, a lot of the expectation was design first. They would walk in, our clients would walk in and say, we want it to look like this. We wanted to, that was that skeuomorphic era. It looks like this in real life. We want it to look like this in digital. And to be clear, it wasn't so much design informed as familiarity informed. It looked familiar to them. It looked like the things that they were touching and feeling in the real world. And so they were automatically bringing that or associating that with what they considered to be design. But in truth, it wasn't design. It was make it look like a thing. It was decorative design.
What's also interesting to me about this phase is it's when I think somewhere in here we merged digital production and design into existing design largely for like print stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's get pixel perfect. We're not just gonna print it, right? We're not gonna get margin and gloss and paper quality wrong. It's gonna be entirely built in a different medium. And so this is where it got really dangerous, right? And we were using tools for print design to design things for digital, and there weren't really digital focused design tools until this next phase, right? Really, I mean, there were some Axure maybe, but Sketch was kind of probably the first real digital GUI design tool. And so this is what we've all been dealing with, I think, still a lot. Right? We have this expectation that design can determine how it's going to look. And the tooling's gotten better, right? We actually see a little bit more of a convergence here in that, design, Figma is doing more to make it look and work and function the way it will be built in code, most likely. We're still working in a design tool, but we're appreciative of the medium of destination, right? We see tools like Framer, things Knapsack can do. A lot of this movement to where tooling is starting to make it easier to get expectation gaps closed. There's still a lot of fracture, right? Still a lot of discipline specific tools and like light connections. And we'll get into some of that, especially with what we think Knapsack can do. But this is the area that we started to see, technological capabilities were starting to inform creative, right? Design systems are helping teams align a lot more closely. There's still a lot of disconnects, reason we built a business here. But, ultimately, teams are able to collaborate more seamlessly around what they have, reuse stuff, understand what it's going to look like in code faster, and, start to close that gap. But I think we're just entering this inflection point. So there's still a long way to go for sure. And then, I think where this is all going, which we'll get to a little bit in the end here, which is exciting, is if we're able to start to put in infrastructure and ways of working that start to close these gaps, we also have set ourselves up for a really exciting future where we're no longer fighting an outdated way of working for a medium we're working in. We're actually starting to work in a way that takes advantage of the medium we're working in, right? The ability to take data, which we'll get into some generative production models where the line between designing and building in code is going to continue to shrink. Tooling is going to continue to be more shared. And we see this really bright future where so many of the pains, again, rooted in this, I didn't think it would look like that. I didn't think the fold would be there and all the other soul crushing things those of us in this industry have lived through a lot, they start to fade away.
Yeah, and the anxiety associated with that as well. I think this is one of the things that's maybe on a lot of people's mind is that they're entering into relationships that are predisposed on, I don't know if you'd call it anxiety, but there's a stress, like an inbound or like an inbuilt stress to that. Hey, I'm a designer. Hey, you're an engineer. We should be in tension with each other. And we don't see that as being the future. We would prefer a future where a designer and an engineer look forward to working with each other because they have their expectations aligned upstream, like right from the beginning, all the way through to the end, instead of what's currently happening, which is, hey, we might be aligned at the beginning because we're having similar conversations, or maybe we're not, maybe we're too siloed. But by the end, we're in a flat out war because expectations of what has been designed is not being coded or vice versa. And that we want to avoid. That's the the workflow of the future that we think is possible.
Absolutely. And so, we're not all ready yet for a product owner gives a prompt and out spits a thing we can ship, and may not even be feasible, but we can start to inch towards some of that. And even with slight shifts from how we're working today, take advantage of the opportunities to get that expectation alignment to avoid the downstream pain, right? And that doesn't mean necessarily wholesale shifts to how we work, although those are on the table. I think I get excited by the idea of this here. I had a design director at a Fortune 500 company tell me, man, I would love my product owners to have access to total clarity of all the things we have and exactly how they could look if we use them and ship them today to inform the PRD. I want to know exactly what we need to work on, right? None of us want to work on stuff we don't need to work on to ship awesome product and make, improve bottom line, improve our customer experience, all that stuff, right? So, whether you're trying to get to this generative production world where we have some customers that we can share some examples of the workflows on this call if we get that far, or you're just trying to not have QA suck so much. There's a lot of opportunity here that we're going to get into.
Well, and practically speaking, there are some really good examples of how this could work right now, today, in that if you've got a design system, you can actually inform the prototype what it will be built out of. Here are the components that exist already. Here is what is already being QA'd. Here is what we trust. Let's go and build something from that. That is already possible today. And I think that might be surprising to some folks who are thinking, well, I got to build a thing first. I got an MVP or build some kind of proof of concept. And then I've got to go back to the drawing board and see whether I can make that thing. Imagine a world where you're letting the design system inform you what's possible right in this very moment. It's like this. You open up the Lego box, you see the Lego pieces, and these are the Lego pieces that all fit together. You can use them right now to start making something versus, should we start designing new Lego pieces? And I think that the fact that that's possible and already being used by companies that we call customers, those ideas are really resonant with this idea of a future informed workflow where you're already on the same page. The engineers have already said, this stuff is coded and works. This stuff works in production. It works live. Here, go and use these same components to make a new thing. Just that alone is a huge step forward.
It is, yeah. And I know the Lego analogy is both powerful and tricky sometimes, but to go with it for a second, there's an app that Lego's come out with where you can literally take a photo of a pile of Legos and it will propose things you can build. We're not that far off from being able to do some very similar things with, here's what I need, here's what I have, machines, AI, help me figure this out, right? And so I do want to take it to that slightly more tactical level. We can get into what some of these workflows really look like. We can show a little bit of how teams are starting to use tools to, power them. And I think there's two real concepts that will be at play here. One of them is the expectation gap. How do we even do what you just said? Some teams are probably saying, well, I can do that today. I have documentation on my system and people know what we have and still doesn't feel that different. I think gets at some of the problems that we try to get at with our platform, in that how do we make sure that you don't just look at what you think you have, you look at what you think you have, how it looks to customers. You actually know exactly, right? Total clarity across all the teams. That's the expectation gap closing. And the other concept is, how can we shift the work to be around a clear delta? And by delta, I mean a gap of what we need to deliver the experience the way we want and what we have. That's always been kind of the point of systems. And yet systems haven't really played out that way for most teams. They've played out as a speeding up comp and UI implementation or creation, but not closing the expectation gap and not really allowing us to only work on that delta as much as we wish we were, right? And so we have some, to continue the foray into Fig Jams, we're going to share number 2 here, which is our little history lesson on digital production from our perspective, part 2. How do we understand the history of digital production? And I recognize these are relatively complex workflows if you're not looking at them for the first time. I want to try and just make it a little easy to understand. We're talking about basically a high-level, genericized sort of web digital app development workflow, right? And when I say classic digital production here, I'm basically referring to my statement a second ago that digital production is just inherited print design. We've got, a brief, we do some IA, some wireframes, we do some visual design, we hand some stuff off, we build it, We put some content in through a CMS probably. We do QA. We do this endless soul crushing loop of QA and revisions and going back to content entry, back to design, back to build. And eventually we launch with, joy and sadness. And so, this is what we've lived through for a long time and probably feels pretty similar to most teams. And we have, stakeholder expectations set very early based on design, a ton of work that goes in, and then lots of time wasted going back because we just have to revisit previously resolved issues or decisions because the stakeholder didn't realize them or they weren't incorporated into the thing that was here. So this is kind of even before thinking about design systems, right? And frankly, at the time, engineers were using components, right? That's not that new a concept.
Yeah,
so that means I was building a thing using something that was always going to look the way it was if we used the button or the menu. And yet, because it didn't look like the thing that was designed, we now have this kerfuffle, right? And it may be that they say, oh, we should just use the thing we already built. But also, it likely showed up as, well, we're going to break that and make it look like the thing that was sold to the stakeholder because that's what they approved. And now we have to break this otherwise performance accessible component, right?
And I think an area of concern here, of course, during this phase was that there wasn't clear ownership over where those things lived, right? Who owned, we call it a design system, but that's really not what it should be called, right? This is where the product lives. This is where the components of the product live. And that was confusing because sometimes it was a design upstream that was doing that. Sometimes it was engineering a little bit further downstream. And that was part of the problem, is that it wasn't just that these things existed, but where did they exist? Who owned them? And at what point did you start using them in that workflow was also confusing.
Exactly, right? And so this gets into phase 2, if you will, this evolution. The same thing, classic digital production, but now we're using systems and we're starting to use them in what we feel is a more mature way. We've got our design docs, we've got our design library. Maybe this is today using Figma, shared libraries and all the modern design system tooling. We got Storybook, we got Zero Height. Mm-hmm. And what's basically happening is, first of all, the big red, hey, this is a problem. The red flags didn't go away as we evolved. We're still setting expectations based purely on this design output. We're still spending a lot of time. We still have a lot of change in a lot of the same revisions because, we've accelerated design, right? We used some pre-built visual elements and styles. We accelerated development. We probably made handoff easy by making some connections. Hey, this should be this thing. Code Connect, great example in there. Hey, you use this in design, it should be this in code. But there's still like loose connections at best, still really fundamentally different systems. And so what we tend to see with these is the QA process doesn't change that much, right? And so what we've shown here is like, yeah, maybe you save 20%. And like, that's huge. 20% is huge. It's scratching the surface of the opportunity, but it's pretty good. But really, again, I view this as we've accelerated a broken way of working, right? We haven't fixed that core problem of expectation gaps. We don't know that we're working on only the gap, the delta, right? We just know that we can make the thing faster because I don't have to make everything from scratch. Better, but still not the best. And this is, again, from our time at Envision to here, so many teams 5-7 years into their system, version 3 of their system, kind of scratching their heads saying we have great buckets of Lego pieces to keep going with that one. We have ways of working, but it doesn't feel that different, right? Yeah, we shipped a little faster, but like teams still get pissed at each other, while we get there, and we still have painful QA and slip timelines and surprises that feel like we shouldn't.
And it's worth mentioning here that, we see a lot of different ways that companies work, and there really isn't a right way and a wrong way. We're not in a position to say you should work this way or you should work that way. But what we do see is that some ways become more sustainable than others. So yes, you may have a feature factory type environment where it's just a grind and you got to get it done. And yes, you are shipping product, but the sustainability of that and the health of that is low. And what you're going to see over time is you're going to lose good people. The talent's going to start falling out of that mix because the good people want to do better work. You're also going to end up with a system that ultimately, as you said, is faster but broken. So you're going to be shipping stuff, but it's not the right stuff. And ultimately, that becomes the problem, is that this kind of back to Gell's law, is that you've now got complexity on top of the things that are more complex themselves, and it becomes very, very difficult to make any changes. So if there is some shift in technology like AI or something like that, it's very difficult to now include those improvements from the ecosystem into that. So that's why the unsustainability or the lack of health in these faster systems has to be considered as well. It's not that they don't ship stuff, it's just that they're an unhealthy way to ship stuff. and it probably won't be sustainable.
So what's different now? What's possible now? And some of this is admittedly what we think is really uniquely possible with Knapsack, or with if you want to build what we've built on your own. And then there's things that we're only starting to scratch the surface of ourselves and doing with customers that are really around, what if we fully take advantage of the opportunity of digital? And fully is probably a little word, but what if we really lean into what we can do with this medium? And so just to go into this, what do we call sort of, how is digital production, that classic version, changed with Knapsack? This is where the expectation gap comes in, right? And I'll show this in our platform. But the whole point of Knapsack is so that you see production design source right next to all the different code sources, and we can see in one place, here's how it looks, here's how the properties do or do not align at a data level. Like, does it look like, is it going to look to customers like it looks in design? And if it doesn't, we can recognize that way early and plan around it. Do we want to update design? Do we want to update the dev? And so what that means is design, what we tend to see is design really does actually accelerate meaningfully, because we start to be able to get at that delta. I know exactly, and this gets into your prototyping comment, which we'll show. I can go compose a page here in Knapsack using my real production components, make a new theme using our variables, collections, and modes setup, and figure out really, really specifically, what do I need to work on, right? Or the design manager or the product owner can, to kind of inform that PRD. And so we're not just saying, well, I have it in my design library, so it should look like that. We're saying, I know how it's going to look in the code library. I know that it's in the design library and not in the engineering library, or in the engineering library and not the design library, right? And so we can get crystal clear of what each other have and are looking at. We tend to see that handoff goes faster, and the expectation gaps, even though they're happening after design, can not necessarily lead to a gap later, because since you're making something with 60% components, don't just look at the Figma comp made of components. Also show exactly how those components look in code. Open up the menu, open the page. I'll show this here in a minute. And so we can say, hey, yeah, we're still in the design phase, but we want to make sure expectations are rooted in the medium of destination, right? What users are going to see, right? And all this has this compounding effect, right? Development starts to accelerate. Design knows exactly what the stuff that's already built is going to look like when it comes out. New stuff is where we focus our effort. Everyone's happy because they're working on unsolved problems. Yep. And then we tend to see that QA and revisions also reduce, just because of that compiling effect of, hey, our expectations were aligned all around. We probably still have that revision, that back and forth, but it should really be focused on those new bespoke things that you made or modifications you made to system elements, not just because, well, I didn't think the menu was going to react like that, because in Figma, it does this when I use the interactive prototype, right? And so that's what we're finally able to start to get around. And we'll jump over here in a minute and show this in product. And what it starts to mean is we start to see some pretty dramatic reduction in timelines. And it's still not the full potential, but almost getting to 50% faster in terms of delivery in a lot of cases.
And this is actually real. We actually have real examples of this. One thing to add to this is that your diagram doesn't even include those companies that use research as part of their flow, where they're taking live production components and putting them in front of customers to test different interactions or flows. Yep. That is going to be speeded up as well. I've worked in organizations where a simple change can sometimes take months, because it has to go through multiple, discovery style or qualitative or quantitative research cycles. Now, because you've got stuff that works, you can take the thing and put it in front of that user and say, does this actually solve the problem that you're seeking? You can do that faster. Research can also have access to this stuff. You can create an environment, you can create a workspace just for them. And so that hasn't even been included here. That's obviously for companies that are research driven. Not everybody is going to do that.
Yeah, but it's a good segue even to just how this might look, even just in the light research that hopefully shows up anyway, as far as design doing their design planning, right? Looking at a wireframe and figuring out, what I'm going to use and how I'm going to build this thing out. And so we're going to get into even more modern ways where we can maybe start prototyping early in a tool like this before design, but even just in this mode of handoff or in design planning, being able to be so crystal clear about how something's going to look. So this is really sort of super simple, right? This is a card component. Everyone's got a card, or a lot of teams have a card. And this one has a couple of subcomponents in it. It's got an author. It's got a button. And so if I wanted this to be, if I'm making a travel site, right? Like I want to make sure I know exactly how this thing's going to look and work and function for the travel site, right? And so I can start to customize this and say, hey, I have this use case based on the content work where there's actually going to be three different CTAs and two authors, which is like, we just ignore our UX problems for now. So what I'm doing really quickly is just in an interactive playground with total freedom based on how components work, and in this case in React, right? I have the ability to come in here and say, I put a third button in, and that's going to be, I don't know, something different. And I can actually go a little bit further here. I can change this and say, look, now I'm going to start to get really granular. And what I'm looking at is I'm going to start customizing this thing to be my exact use case, all using production code, no matter, what, no controls or knobs need to be set up by sort of engineers. This just is available because we've built these components. And so, refer a friend, you get where I'm going here. I can start to make all this out just, again, to validate. We have teams who actually do this almost as part of a QA effort of design, where they say, hey, can I do with the system all the things that I tried to do with the component in Figma? Can I do it with React or with, there's a lot of frameworks here. We have, web components or whatever, all the ways your thing's been built. We can say, is it going to look like and do the thing we just did? Right. And we'll get more into prototyping, but even being able to just do this at, a section level, right? It doesn't always need to be an individual piece. It doesn't always need to be a whole page. We will show that here, but being able to come in quickly to a 3-column layout and, work within one of these, or, apply a new theme that we can then go customize the theme as well. Being able to do all this on the fly really early in the process and know like, hey, literally everything I'm looking at this is how it would be implemented with our system if we did it today. Opening up this capability to all, less technical disciplines, not always requiring a sit-down meeting with engineering to know exactly what is coming from, these are all our production, in this case, React components. We just give this ability to get that expectation gap closed, right? And even just at the system level, being able to go through and say, hey, we got the button in Figma, we've got it in code. How does it look? Does it look the same in React as it looks in Figma? There are little differences here. So like being able to set the stage of, hey, they look different. What do we want to do about that during a handoff meeting, and not, hey, why do they look different? Now we have to add a week to the timeline to go fix it all in QA, right? Huge difference just from being able to see what each other are looking at.
And also reduces all that anxiety about how to communicate, right? Instead of saying, this thing is broken, or you didn't do what I expected, or it's not working, it's much more about, oh, I see what the differences are. Let's repair those, or let's bring those into parity. It's a kind of conversation.
So it is. So again, I still view this as what we're talking about. This is just how teams can do what they're doing now a little bit better with a little bit more clarity, right? And what's really exciting to me, though, and why we've all been screaming for years that digital production should evolve, right? Everything we've been saying here, this has been, this conversation is very old at Knapsack. But what we're so excited about is the validation of this readiness of the industry, this inflection that we're starting to see. Well, I'll show you more features of how we have it, but seeing Figma and Builder.io do a webinar about how do you go from Figma to your React code really quickly. Seeing Supernova launch a beta of a language prompt-based creation tool that generates a UI using your production components. All of some of the stuff we have where you can pull in Figma and pull in code and look at the props together here and see how well they're aligned. All of this is starting to hint at a market, like industry-wide appreciation of this problem that we're harping on here today, right? Hey, we got to not just assume it's going to look like the picture, right? When we're going to go make it in a completely different medium, right? And so seeing that start to show up is also leading us to this sort of, more modern way of working where, see here, design begins with code, not necessarily from scratch, right? But the idea that one of the really approachable ways we see it, using some of what I was just showing you, is I go in based on a wireframe, right? This is a near-term, a small behavior shift, which is the easier ones to make. And we say, hey, we've got wireframes. Let's go try and make the wireframe with what we have. Right? And I understand some of you may be on like highly bespoke experiences. It's obviously not going to fit everywhere, but when we work with pharmaceutical companies that make 300 websites, right? For any drug has patient, awareness, healthcare provider, all these different sites. And, there are a lot of simple content forms, not a ton of complexity, but they fall into some of this stuff up here or it's for years have, right? Where we've spent a really long time in design for something that isn't, the delta in these projects is small, right? They've built flexible systems that can power so much, and yet it takes so long to build a site. So what we're starting to see them do is say, hey, I got the wireframe. Let's just go see if, we think with 80+% of the site should be able to be covered with our system. Let's go make that, look at it, And instead of spending months to get to a comp to review with a stakeholder, we have a link within a week or a couple hours that says, yo, here's what the landing page could look like. I made the new theme by adding a new mode. I put your logo in. Let's start there. Or anyone in agencies, what a better way to start a customer engagement. It's like, hey, here's how we could start to build things really rapidly in your brand. Let's figure out what we need to do more uniquely for you and riff on that. Right? It's so powerful, and it's so uncomfortable though, because we've been saying for years, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the agencies, because everybody's going to have an external partner. It may not be an agency, but they're going to have maybe a marketing partner. Maybe they're going to have a product marketing partner. They're going to have others, even like you said, stakeholders, executives who want to see what's being made, how it's being made, and at what cost it's being made at. And for the agencies and for the external partners like marketing, they need to be able to work side by side with these designs so that they can deliver that message and that design in the manner in which it's been considered, or the way that it was intended. And that's really something that is new. We couldn't do that 15 years ago. We couldn't do that 10 years ago. It's been very, very hard. We had to literally hand code and hand roll UI kits for every single individual client to try and bring the agency client relationship side by side. Now it's possible for like one of these large pharmaceutical companies or anybody that has a big marketing footprint to be able to have that relationship with their agencies, where they can, instead of it being, well, you guys are going to start from scratch every time we bring a new agency in, or you have to get up to scratch on how we work. It's, here is all of the stuff you need. Start there. It's already been signed off on, in the sense that it's live code, it works. And that's a huge advantage.
Absolutely. And this is where, I mean, we're starting to see really massive change. There's a note in here that we ran out of the ability to make the timelines look proportionally accurate, because text size and kerning are real challenges to everyone, right? So imagine this line goes further out to the right? So major changes, right? For teams that are spending months through design for not that bespoke experiences, we're talking about saving a large part of those months, right? I'm not saying don't do design. I'm saying design and the important stuff, and move on to other problems, move on to your backlog. And just to show real quick what this could look like, I think the agency example is a good one. Here's another example of prototyping in Knapsack. This has, you see, a bunch of different components stacked together to make a landing page, right? And I can, without the code, I can open this in a new window, and I can share this with folks and say, hey, here's what your homepage could look like. And we have some different themes. We have different density settings. We have different themes for all these, et cetera. Basis light, blah, blah, blah. And if I wanted to make one of these for Knapsack, right, for my new customer that's Knapsack, I could come in here and say, hey, I'm just going to add a mode, and I could select a few things. Let's just do some colors. I can select from tokens. I can select from theme color. I can go in and put this theme color. Let's make it pink. Let's put a font in here. I copied not a font. I copied a logo earlier, and so I think even that might just be enough. And let's call it Knapsack. And so if my new customer was Knapsack and I wanted to go show them building pages with a bunch of components that we've made a million times, I could go in here and say, hey, here's the Knapsack theme. I got my Knapsack logo, and then I could go start customizing through all the stuff I was doing before. Let's look at our grid. It's going to have multiple cards, and let's make this card have, a button in it, because that button's going to show, et cetera. Right. And so we can, go crazy from here and customize, but we're looking at something that's what your customers would see. And we can even show, probably running out of time here, but show how this could start in Figma, right? Oh, I made things in Figma with my components. Let me really quickly see how those would look with the same components in code. Because ultimately in Figma, you've got components and properties. Over here in Knapsack, you've got components and properties. You've got styling that's going through variables, collections, modes, ultimately to tokens. And so we can really marry these worlds and start to, when I showed that Figma diagram of like, hey, the dots start to get closer together because there's new tooling, there's new ways of working. This is where we're starting to see, and there's a long way to go with a lot of this stuff, right? And we're actually actively looking for folks to do some more testing of this as we get near GA. But the ability to get people hands-on, to not only get the clarity and close the expectation gap, but to also understand that delta, the gap of what they need to deliver with just total clarity across the board. I mean, there's that 60 to 80% number is not fake. We have POCs we're doing with teams on pushing that agenda right now. And it does start to get into some of the generative AI stuff that we can speak to just briefly here. But this is the exciting future. And again, it's when showing teams this sort of thing, or those webinars we talked about, and hearing design leaders say, oh, man, I want to do less time, and I want to spend less time in Figma. Oh man, I want my product owners to know exactly what we can do with what we have, because everyone's tired of working on the same stuff only to run into headaches again. There's a better way, folks. So it's exciting times.
Yeah, I think you've hinted at a couple of things here. The one thing, of course, is that there's this kind of brand management promise. You talked about marketing, being able to quickly theme different sites and manage that portfolio. That's a big deal, right? We've always had to have this kind of CMS-led universe where unless the CMS supported it, you weren't able to do that. So that's kind of a breakthrough, that a promise for brand management. The other one that you mentioned, which we haven't shown yet, which is taking those Figma integrations directly into your design system so that there's parity between what's happening in Figma and what you can actually visualize in your design system. That we're able to do now. That's another big unlock, if you will. And then the last thing you kind of hinted at, which was, how do we know that this is working? The metrics by which you understand your production flow, your production output, your production management has always been a little bit of a confusion, because if you've got, metrics like, well, we've got commits on the engineering side, or we've got numbers of tasks completed, or we've got a burned out chart that we're going through, those don't really inform the health of the product or the velocity that you can get something from one place to another. And I'm even afraid to use the word velocity because it's not a really good measure of success. It doesn't tell you that the customer actually received the value you were trying to deliver. Built into this workflow that you've just described is that inherent lack of friction, which you can now start to see at a metrics level and say, oh, we can now see where we're making advances. We can now see where the blockages were that we've unblocked. And we can actually see the cycle time from design to code, which will be the topic of our next webinar, go faster. So just in looking at that cycle alone, that arc, if you will, has massive potential for production managers, for engineers, for designers who are trying to understand how they can convey what they do to their leadership, to their teams. This is what we do. This is how long it takes. This is where we're blocked right now. This is how we can get unblocked. A lot of this is about those metrics conversations. In fact, it's probably, it happens every single day, but every time I go into LinkedIn, I see a product manager saying, do I explain to my leadership that we're doing better than we were a year ago?
Yeah.
Like, what metrics do I use? I can't really use this idea of, velocity anymore, because we know that faster is just shipping more crap quickly. It's not actually shipping better stuff.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on, and it's a really good segue to the last thing with a couple minutes left before we open it up for Q&A that I wanted to cover, which is, a lot. We're not all ready for this yet, but we see an interesting trend with Fortune 500 CTO initiatives right now, where they're all focused on replatforming. Design to Code webinar next month is going to be about this too. There are a lot of teams poking at generative production, poking at their own language models. They're all terrified. They haven't figured out the data security, InfoSec side of things yet, but they know that they can't leverage the power of these things in the future if everything in their ecosystem is built differently. They're starting to tackle those old products that were been only engineering led for 40 years, right? And this is a real workflow, anonymized from a customer we're working with, that is looking at, in this case, very, very templated things. So 90 to 100% templated email, websites, et cetera, for large scale rapid production. And essentially, some of the things we've shown you, Knapsack's fitting in this UI and render sort of editor environment. But they have POCs of, I can put in a prompt and get a data output that incorporates content from a pre-approved content service, so it doesn't have to go through regulatory. Brand assets from a DAM, UI elements from a React package library or whatever. And ultimately, these are all going to go into, Adobe Experience Manager, Drupal, Viva systems for email, webmail, whatever it is, all the different things. But there's this workflow of, we've got formal review, we got all these parts coming together. But this idea of, I tell it what I need, I get a thing generated using a bunch of pre-approved production-ready stuff. Yeah, we have review and approval. We're going to make edits. We're going to need to tweak some content, whatever. And in reality, as this expands to less templated experiences, there'd be the, hey, and then I have my bespoke creation part, and that's in the workflow diagram we showed. But then they're really very quickly, with minimal unnecessary work, getting through formal approvals, regulatory approvals, legal approvals, to the place where the stuff really just gets implemented and deployed. And it doesn't actually matter that we're working on a fully implemented thing. We just need the gap between what people see and approve in this part and their expectations to be what's going to come out the end. And so if the thing that gets delivered on AEM or whatever uses all the same content and brand assets and not UI elements that we can use in this really early stage, that's starting to be, I mean, this is a real thing. We're POCing this in the rest of this year with teams. So there's a lot of pieces under here of how we tie this together. But, you know, from a platform standpoint, what we see is, first off, bring people together, bring design and code together in one environment, close the expectation gap. When you close the expectation gap, you can start to find ways to really understand the delta you need to work on. And when you have this infrastructure that's integrated across design and code, you've set the perfect foundation for this, right? Whether you're ready for it this year, next year, 2026, 2027. And to tie back to the data piece you just said, in reality, the mature future we see in probably the next 24 months in reality is data is the other bucket here. Data for how your system is used to deliver experiences and data for how those experiences perform. Can you imagine a future where you know exactly how the last combination of delivery led to certain conversion rates, and you're able to use that information in the language prompt, or better yet, I don't know, Skynet AI self-optimizes your checkout flow because delivery can be more standardized. We all have data to inform it. We're all know what each other are looking at. It feels light years ahead of, oh man, I made posters and now I'm pissed that they look different when we remade them in code. But it's happening so fast, right? And exponential changes in growth is that knee of the curve. It feels linear or it feels flat, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, it's a whole new world. We're seeing with that with the rate of technological advancement. But you know, more importantly, we're seeing that right now. We're living through it with digital production, and so we're clearly very excited about this, and love to talk about it. Love to share insights. Love to connect you all with others that are thinking about this, planning for it, not sure how to be ready. So. Yeah.
And that's part of the purpose of these leadership summits as well, is to actually get people in the room together that are sharing their experiences. So, hey, you work at a big retailer, I work at a big retailer, we're trying to solve problems, we're getting in the same room together, we're looking at each other eye to eye and saying, wow, we didn't realize we were trying to solve the same problems, and you can actually share these things. So yeah, it's going back to pre-COVID interactions, face-to-face, you know, sweaty hands, but it's good. It's what we need. Should we open this up for Q&A? I'm sure there's a couple of questions.
Yeah, let's do it. I know we like I said, it's broad topic, so we've gone a good ways here. Let's pause, give people a chance to ask any other questions. And there's a few that have come in. And again, you know, as you're typing those, please use reach out to us on LinkedIn. The most valuable thing we can do is connect you all with others like you that are thinking about this stuff, talking about this stuff. Everything that we've just shared is not just our own musings and thoughts. It's really been informed by thousands of conversations that, you know, Richard and I and the others here have had for the past several years, really, with folks like y'all just thinking about this stuff specifically.
Yeah.
You know, one of the questions I get a lot about this is tooling related, and we're a software company, right? And so thank you for sitting through the timeshare portions of this, where we did want to show you parts of Knapsack. But you know, what are the other tools that are out there doing this? And I think you know, there's a lot that are getting at it. I think most teams that we see that have really solved this problem well, that aren't Knapsack customers, a lot of them have built their own stuff, or they've spent a lot of time creating glue code connections or human workflows to manage the fact that, you know, what I see in Figma and Zero Height and Storybook and product might all be a little different. There are ways you can deal with that with human overhead. You know, I think the things that Figma is doing are fantastic in terms of helping close this gap. I think they also, you know, it's a lot of what we've shared here is about how do you get people closer to the medium of destination and delivery. And Figma, a lot of times, is kind of pulling people, still working upstream, but trying to pull in more insights from downstream. And so it's just really interesting to see all the ways that the community, the industry is attempting to solve this. So it appears to be nearing unanimous support for, we got to modernize this. We're in the stone age of digital production, relatively speaking. And yet how that comes to life, there's a lot of different philosophies and things folks are enthusiastic or not about. So.
And part of our work is also talking to business leaders. So we're also asking them how they're making choices about what to use and how to implement it. We all know that SaaS as a whole has had to take a hard look at itself and decide, you know, is it still relevant? What will happen when and if AI makes some changes to the way that people work? And so what we're hearing from business people as well is we're tired of supporting a ton of different point solutions. we've got a huge stack. There's this kind of Venn diagram that starts to look like the Audi logo, where you've got a Venn diagram next to a Venn diagram next to a Venn diagram. We're like, this is the point solution, this is the point solution. And these things don't all talk to each other. And I think what business leaders, especially when we talk to CTOs and CFOs, they're asking questions around, how do we make the tool set also less complicated for everybody, so that they're not trying to learn a whole new set of functionality and understanding around how these things work? How do we make sure that they do integrate, if integrate at all? And how do we then pay for that, right? So there's what we just showed you, this cost saving in terms of time has a bottom line, effect or implication, impact for the business. The business is then turning around saying, well, if we're shipping quickly, if we're able to reduce the amount of friction here, and we can do it with fewer point solutions, then we can actually provide the teams with the resources that they need. That could be in any form. It could be like, hey, here's your budget to go and experiment with that thing you want. Here's the budget to actually ship the product you need. Here's a salary increase. Hey, we're not going to do layoffs this year because we can actually afford to keep everybody on team. I think those are really important considerations here. It's not just, does the thing do the thing that I need it to do, but does it actually deliver value to my customer and to my team, so that the company can get excited about it as well. At the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, when the renewals come around, everybody's looking at each other going, hey, that thing that we bought 10 years ago, we're not using and we still haven't used, like, what are we doing about that? Stack consolidation is definitely a part of this conversation. It's not just about workflow in the design, engineering, product context, but it's workflow in the business context as well.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. In this, it's where we've seen the most success and interest with, large companies really focusing resources on this is, hey, a lot of these can start to be solved with, a single stone, if you will. We've got, more clarity to solve a simple human problem that comes with a simplification of your stack as well, right? And there's simplification of overhead and things we try to do to automate it. So, for all the wonderful things Knapsack can do and Gen AI exploration and all this, the reality is it's still about a human problem first and foremost. And going back to the very first thing you said, how do we create some simplicity in incredibly complex environments and workflows, right? Digital production is messy. It always will be chaotic. And so how do we put a circle around that, make it a little more manageable for humans, and also do it in a way that we feel good about the foundation for the future that we've set?
That's it.
With that, that's all we got. So appreciate you all hanging out.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll share the recording again. If you made it this far on the recording, thank you. I hope you had a wonderful lunch. And we'll hopefully hear from some of you soon. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, everyone.